While Donald Trump stood before reporters dismissing Canada as irrelevant to American interests, as a nation whose economic relationship with the United States matters so little that he could casually wave away decades of integrated commerce and supply chains with characteristic hand gestures and rambling assertions, Mark Carney descended from his aircraft onto the tarmac at Beijing Capital International Airport to receive a reception that conveyed unmistakable strategic significance through every carefully orchestrated detail. Red carpets unfurled with the precision that characterizes Chinese state ceremonies. Formal diplomatic protocols executed with the meticulous attention to symbolic messaging that Beijing deploys when it wishes to communicate something important to the world. Senior Chinese officials, figures of genuine power within the Communist Party hierarchy rather than mid-level functionaries assigned to routine diplomatic duties, personally present on the tarmac to greet the first Canadian Prime Minister to visit China in 8 years, arriving at the explicit personal invitation of President Xi Jinping himself rather than through the normal channels of diplomatic scheduling. Two images presented simultaneously to the world, broadcast through global media networks, analyzed by foreign policy professionals, absorbed by governments calculating their own relationships with both nations. Two fundamentally opposed realities about Canada's position in contemporary international relations. Two completely different assessments of Canadian strategic significance. One leader, the American president, commanding the world's largest economy and most powerful military, publicly dismissing Canada as strategically and economically insignificant as a nation that needs the United States desperately while America could sever the relationship without meaningful consequence. Another leader, the Canadian Prime Minister, representing a middle power with a fraction of American population and economic output, publicly embraced by the world's second-largest economy, with ceremonies and symbolism meticulously designed to communicate that Canada possesses strategic value worthy of the highest diplomatic courtesies normally reserved for major powers. And the stark, almost shocking contrast between these images, between Trump's dismissive rhetoric delivered with his typical blend of bluster and incoherence and Beijing's elaborate ceremonial welcome, executed with characteristic Chinese attention to symbolic detail, could not have unsettled Donald Trump more profoundly or exposed more clearly the degree to which his fundamental assumptions about Canadian dependence and American indispensability are collapsing under the weight of strategic realities that he apparently cannot comprehend or refuses to acknowledge. No real advantage to us, Trump declared to assembled reporters with characteristic bluntness. His tone conveying the dismissiveness that he apparently believes projects strength and dominance, but increasingly reveals anxiety and defensiveness about developments he cannot control. It's irrelevant to me. Canada would love it. Canada wants it. They need it because we don't need Canada product. That's the thing, you know. I want to be a nice person, but we don't need I want to build the cars here, not in Canada. We used to build cars in Canada. Now the Canada cars, the Canadians are moving here to build cars. Same thing with Mexico. Same thing with Japan. Japan's paid us billions and billions of dollars for the privilege of making cars here and selling cars. That rambling defensive statement, that insistence delivered with unusual vehemence that Canada needs the United States far more than America needs Canada. That claim unsupported by actual trade statistics or supply chain realities that automotive production is naturally returning to American soil through some inevitable economic gravity reveals something profoundly important that Trump almost certainly does not intend to reveal about his psychological state and his assessment of the situation. It exposes profound unease about the shifting dynamics of North American relations, about the uncomfortable reality that Canada, under Carney's leadership, is systematically, deliberately, successfully constructing alternatives to dependence on American markets and American goodwill. Alternatives that fundamentally alter the power dynamics that have governed the bilateral relationship for generations. This Beijing visit was not routine diplomatic engagement of the type that fills calendars of heads of government, not a standard bilateral meeting between trading partners, maintaining cordial but unremarkable relations characterized by periodic consultations and photo opportunities. This was Beijing deliberately, strategically, with careful forethought sending a message not merely to Canada, but directly to Washington, to the Trump administration, to anyone observing global power dynamics with careful attention and strategic sophistication. China did not simply receive Carney as visiting head of government deserving of standard diplomatic courtesies appropriate to his office, the kind of respectful but unremarkable reception that protocol demands. They elevated him through state-level treatment normally reserved for leaders of major powers through language carefully chosen and vetted at the highest levels to emphasize the magnitude and historical significance of the visit through repeated references in official Chinese government statements to a fundamental reset in Canada-China relations after years of tension and distance following the Meng Wanzhou affair and subsequent diplomatic freeze. That level of ceremonial attention, that investment of Chinese diplomatic capital and presidential time and political energy does not occur casually or accidentally in a system as hierarchical and carefully managed as Chinese foreign policy. It happens only when Beijing perceives genuine strategic value in the relationship. Only when Chinese leadership has concluded after careful deliberation that deepening engagement with Canada serves important national interests that justify elevating a middle power to this unprecedented level of attention and commitment. And they absolutely do perceive that value, have clearly made that calculation because Carney represents something that Trump demonstrably no longer embodies in international relations. Something that nations around the world are desperately seeking. Predictability, reliability, the fundamental qualities that make partnerships sustainable and valuable across changes in domestic politics and leadership transitions. A leader who respects international agreements and treaty obligations rather than treating them as suggestions subject to unilateral modification or abandonment whenever politically convenient or when they impose constraints he dislikes. A leader who comprehends trade-offs and complexity and the reality that international relations involve balancing competing interests rather than approaching every relationship as zero-sum competition requiring total domination of the other party. A leader who does not govern through constant threats and intimidation and unpredictable policy reversals that create perpetual uncertainty for partners and allies attempting to maintain stable long-term relationships. Those characteristics matter enormously in contemporary international affairs, carry tremendous strategic value, particularly in a global system where nations across every continent are desperately attempting to reduce their exposure to American volatility to insulate themselves from the chaos and unpredictability that has characterized American foreign policy under Trump's leadership and that shows no signs of moderating as his second term progresses. Almost on cue, almost as though his public statements were deliberately timed to confirm the anxieties and insecurities driving his dismissive rhetoric about Canadian insignificance, Trump lashed out when reporters asked about the USMCA trade agreement and the broader state of relations with Canada. He waved off the question with characteristic hand gestures designed to convey that the subject barely merits his attention or concern, that he is so confident in American dominance that Canadian actions are simply irrelevant to his strategic calculations. Said Canada needs the agreement desperately, that the entire Canadian economy depends on preferential access to American markets while the United States could abandon the relationship without suffering any meaningful economic consequence. Claimed America does not need Canadian-made automobiles or automotive parts, that these products are easily replaceable, that American manufacturing can absorb all production without difficulty, insisted that everything should be manufactured within the United States, regardless of economic efficiency considerations or supply chain realities or the decades of integration that have made North American automotive production a seamlessly connected system. But here is the critical observation, the key analytical insight that explains Trump's reaction and reveals what is actually occurring beneath the surface rhetoric. That was not a display of strength or confidence or secure dominance. That was manifestation of anxiety, of psychological discomfort, about control slipping away, about leverage eroding, about a situation evolving in directions that Trump cannot manage through his normal toolkit of threats and pressure. When Trump declares with unusual emphasis that something doesn't matter to me, when he insists with extraordinary vehemence that he is completely unconcerned about a particular development or relationship or challenge to American interests, the statement almost invariably signals the opposite psychological reality. It reveals that he is deeply concerned, profoundly unsettled, struggling desperately to maintain the appearance of dominance and control while watching the actual substance of power shift in ways that undermine his position. Because this confrontation, this public disagreement manifesting through dueling images of Carney's Beijing reception and Trump's dismissive comments, was never really about automotive production statistics or trade deficit calculations or tariff rates or any of the specific technical details that Trump cited. It was about control, about leverage, about whether Trump retains the capacity to bend Canada to American demands through economic pressure and threats of market access restrictions. Trump could effectively pressure Canada, could threaten and coerce and extract concessions on trade terms and regulatory harmonization and countless other issues only so long as Canada possessed nowhere else to turn.
No realistic alternatives to American markets and American partnerships that could provide comparable economic opportunity.
That world, that comfortable reality where American economic dominance and geographic proximity guaranteed Canadian compliance, regardless of how badly Washington treated the relationship or how unreasonable American demands became, is ending rapidly and visibly. And Trump's rhetoric, his insistence that he doesn't care about Canadian actions, even as he clearly does care intensely and is deeply troubled by the implications, demonstrates that he recognizes the fundamental shift, even if he cannot articulate it coherently or respond strategically with anything beyond bluster and dismissiveness for years, stretching back through multiple American administrations, but intensifying dramatically under Trump's uniquely aggressive and transactional approach to
managing relationships with allies and neighbors.
Trump's leverage over Canada rested fundamentally on one assumption, one belief about structural economic reality that seemed so obvious and incontestable that it required no examination or empirical justification or strategic reconsideration. The assumption embedded in American policy planning and political rhetoric was that Canada had nowhere else to go economically, that if Washington applied sufficient pressure through automotive sector threats or comprehensive tariff impositions or demands for complete renegotiation of trade agreement terms, Ottawa would eventually capitulate and accept American terms because the American market was simply too dominant economically, too integrated into every aspect of Canadian production and distribution, too essential to Canadian prosperity and employment to be replaced or even significantly reduced without causing economic catastrophe. Mark Carney is systematically dismantling that assumption in real time, not through rhetorical challenges or empty threats, but through concrete actions and actual diplomatic and economic initiatives that create genuine alternatives rather than merely threatening to seek alternatives as negotiating tactic designed to extract better terms from the United States. Canada is no longer operating from fear or from position of absolute dependence on American goodwill and market access. Europe has re-engaged substantively with Canada after years of relative neglect during which European attention focused primarily on managing relationships with the United States and dealing with internal European Union challenges. Recognizing now that Canada offers reliable partnership at precisely the moment when American reliability under Trump has become questionable at best, Asian markets are opening systematically to Canadian exports, to Canadian investment, to Canadian resource development partnerships, to the kind of long-term strategic economic relationships that were previously impossible or impractical due to geographic distance and lack of transportation infrastructure, but now appear increasingly attractive. As Asian economies grow and as Canadian determination to diversify creates opportunities, and now China, the world's second-largest economy, the rising power that Trump himself identifies repeatedly as America's primary strategic competitor and greatest long-term threat, is not merely talking to Canada through routine diplomatic channels and maintaining correct but distant relations. It is welcoming Canada's Prime Minister at the highest possible diplomatic level with ceremonies and symbolism meticulously designed to communicate that Beijing views Canada as strategically significant partner worthy of presidential attention rather than as American satellite whose independent agency can be safely ignored when making strategic calculations. That development fundamentally changes the balance of power in North American relations, shifts the dynamics in ways that should concern American strategists, but that Trump apparently struggles to comprehend beyond recognizing at visceral level that something important is changing.
Pressure, threats, economic coercion.
These tactics only function effectively as tools of statecraft when the target possesses no alternatives. When isolation makes resistance economically impossible, regardless of principle or political preference, threats only generate desired compliance when the threatened party faces genuine vulnerability with no realistic options for escaping the threatened consequences or replacing the relationships being jeopardized. Trump understands this dynamic at some intuitive level, even if he cannot articulate it in sophisticated strategic terms or academic language, which is why his tone has shifted perceptibly from the confident dominance that characterized his first-term approach to Canada when he felt secure in his leverage and comfortable demanding concessions toward the irritation and defensiveness that now marks his public statements whenever Canada or Carney come up in press conferences or interviews. Views when he insists with unusual vehemence that Canada needs the trade deal more than the United States needs it. He is not describing objective economic reality so much as reacting psychologically to the loss of control, to the uncomfortable recognition that his leverage is eroding month by month as Carney builds alternatives. When he dismisses Canadian manufacturing with obvious contempt. When he claims confidently that automotive production is naturally returning to American soil through inexorable economic forces, he is signaling frustration that Canada is no longer trapped inside a single economic corridor subject to American veto over major economic and strategic decisions. Carney is not cutting ties with the United States, is not pursuing the kind of dramatic rupture or confrontational break that would damage Canadian economic interests severely and play directly into Trump's preferred narrative about Canadian hostility and anti-American sentiment driving Ottawa's policy choices. He is doing something far more strategically sophisticated and far more dangerous to Trump's entire approach to managing the bilateral relationship and maintaining American dominance in North America. He is making Canada optional in ways that fundamentally alter negotiating dynamics, optional to American pressure and threats, optional to American coercion and ultimatums, optional to American demands for compliance. And once a country reaches that position of genuine optionality, once it possesses credible alternatives that provide leverage in negotiations and that make walking away from bad deals economically viable, intimidation stops working as a reliable tool of statecraft. This is where the narrative becomes genuinely dangerous for Trump's strategic position and for American interests more broadly. Where the erosion of American leverage manifests in concrete economic and political consequences that cannot be dismissed or wished away through bluster. If the United States proceeds with threats to rip automotive manufacturing out of Canada through prohibitive tariffs or regulatory barriers or direct prohibition on imports, if Trump follows through on his repeated rhetoric about forcing all production back to American territory, regardless of economic efficiency or supply chain disruption, Carney now possesses options that did not exist or were not economically realistic just years ago. Trade relations and tariff structures are expected to dominate the agenda during Carney's Beijing visit. According to multiple reports from journalists covering the diplomatic engagement and from Canadian officials providing background briefings on condition of anonymity, many embattled Canadian industries, economic sectors that have suffered for years under trade retaliation and market access restrictions imposed during previous disputes are hoping desperately that this high-level visit produces tangible relief on Chinese tariffs that have devastated agricultural exports and cost Canadian farmers billions in lost revenue. Meanwhile, within the Canadian automotive sector, serious concern is mounting among industry executives and union leaders that any relief on agricultural tariffs might be strategically linked by Chinese negotiators to the lifting of Canadian tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles, creating a complex trade-off that would have profound implications for North American automotive markets and that would force difficult political choices. Carney's visit occurs precisely as his government faces mounting domestic political pressure to forge new trade alliances beyond North America to diversify aggressively away from overwhelming dependence on the American market that leaves Canada perpetually vulnerable to American political volatility to demonstrate concretely that Canada possesses genuine agency and realistic options rather than remaining trapped in perpetual vulnerability to whatever chaos emanates from Washington. China is not merely interested in selling electric vehicles into the Canadian market as finished products, though that commercial opportunity certainly motivates Beijing's engagement and would benefit Chinese manufacturers struggling with overcapacity. Chinese leadership is interested in something far more strategically significant for both nations. Building manufacturing facilities on Canadian soil, establishing integrated supply chains that connect Chinese technology and manufacturing expertise and capital with Canadian resources and skilled workforce, developing comprehensive battery production infrastructure that would position Canada as major player in the global transition to electric mobility rather than remaining peripheral to the most important industrial transformation of the coming decades. That Chinese strategic vision means cheaper, higher quality electric vehicles becoming available to Canadian consumers at prices that internal combustion vehicles increasingly cannot match. As economies of scale and battery production drive costs down, it means tens of thousands of well-paying Canadian manufacturing jobs in sectors that represent the future of automotive production rather than clinging to past technologies facing inevitable obsolescence. It means Canada potentially transforming into a major electric vehicle manufacturing hub, a center of production, serving not merely domestic Canadian demand, but North American markets and potentially global export opportunities in regions seeking to reduce dependence on Chinese or American production. And here is the dimension that Trump understands perfectly. The aspect that explains his visible agitation about Carney's Beijing reception and the broader implications of deepening Canada-China economic ties. Chinese electric vehicles manufactured in Canada using Chinese technology and capital would sit immediately adjacent to the American border, would be produced mere hours by truck or rail from major American population centers and automotive markets, competing directly and devastatingly with American automotive production on price, because Chinese manufacturing efficiency and scale economies create cost advantages that American producers cannot match. Competing on technology that American manufacturers have struggled unsuccessfully for years to develop and commercialize. Competing on the manufacturing scale that Chinese industrial capacity enables through state support and coordinated planning. That scenario would prove economically devastating for the American automotive industry, particularly as it struggles unsuccessfully to maintain global competitiveness as it falls further behind Chinese and European manufacturers in the critical transition to electric mobility that will define the industry for decades, as it depends increasingly on protectionist measures and government subsidies rather than genuine innovation and efficiency to preserve market share. This is why Trump lashes out with such obvious vehemence and barely controlled anger when reporters ask about Canada and when he observes Carney being welcomed in Beijing. Not because Canada is weak or economically irrelevant as he claims repeatedly, but because Canada is no longer dependent, no longer trapped, no longer subject to American dictation in ways that Trump took for granted and that formed the foundation of his negotiating strategy. Simultaneously with the electric vehicle discussions, Carney's negotiating team is pushing aggressively on agricultural trade issues, on removing or substantially reducing the Chinese tariffs that have devastated Canadian farmers for years and that have created genuine economic distress in rural communities across Canadian agricultural regions. Canola exports, seafood products, pork shipments. These are sectors employing hundreds of thousands of Canadians that have been caught for years in the crossfire of trade retaliation between major powers, suffering enormous economic damage as their products faced punitive tariffs or outright market access bans in crucial Chinese markets that previously absorbed huge volumes of Canadian production. For Canadian farmers struggling with debt and falling incomes. For fishing communities watching processing plants close and boats sitting idle. For agricultural workers facing unemployment, the costs have been real and immediate and severe, measured not in abstract statistics, but in lost family income and farm foreclosures and community economic decline. And for a prolonged period stretching across several years, Ottawa possessed very limited room to maneuver. Very few realistic options for addressing the crisis beyond hoping that broader geopolitical tensions would eventually ease and that trade relations would normalize without requiring Canadian concessions. That situation is changing fundamentally as Carney builds alternatives and as China recognizes that Canada now possesses genuine options. China recognizes that Canada no longer must accept whatever terms Beijing chooses to offer, because walking away from Chinese markets no longer means economic catastrophe when European and other Asian markets are opening and when diversification provides real alternatives. Canada recognizes reciprocally that it no longer must negotiate from position of desperation or fear, that it can credibly walk away from unsatisfactory terms because other partnerships and other markets provide viable economic opportunities. This negotiation is not about achieving quick diplomatic wins or securing symbolic gestures that generate positive headlines without changing underlying economic fundamentals. This is about restoring genuine balance to the bilateral relationship, about ensuring that trade occurs on mutually acceptable terms that benefit both parties rather than through one side imposing conditions on the other through superior leverage. Even incremental progress on canola market access sends powerful signal that trade retaliation is not permanent. That established patterns can shift when circumstances change. That Canada can push back against unfavorable treatment without automatically triggering dangerous escalation. For Beijing, stabilizing agricultural trade with Canada makes straightforward economic sense beyond any diplomatic or strategic considerations, provides reliable supply of high-quality products that Chinese consumers demand increasingly as middle class expands, removes a persistent irritant from the bilateral relationship that has complicated cooperation on other issues. For Ottawa, any progress on agricultural market access demonstrates conclusively that diversification works as strategy, that building alternatives to American markets creates genuine leverage that can be deployed effectively across multiple relationships. And for Trump, watching anxiously from Washington, each incremental Canadian success in diversifying trade represents another reminder that Canada is no longer boxed in economically or politically. No longer subject to the kind of total dependence that made American pressure irresistible and that allowed Trump to extract concessions. That is what makes this particular moment qualitatively different from previous episodes of tension or difficult negotiation in the long history of Canada-United States relations.
This visit is not about
Canada choosing sides definitively in great power competition between the United States and China. Is not about Ottawa abandoning the American alliance or Western orientation to align with China against the United States in some new Cold War configuration. It is about ending structural vulnerability that has characterized Canadian economic and strategic position for generations. About ensuring that Canada never again finds itself completely hostage to the political mood swings and policy chaos and unpredictable decision-making of any single partner, regardless of how large or powerful or geographically proximate. For too long, measured in decades stretching back to the post-war period, Canada's economic structure has left it dangerously exposed to whatever transpires in American domestic politics without any meaningful capacity to insulate Canadian interests from American decisions. When pressure emanated from Washington, whether justified by legitimate policy concerns or driven purely by political theater and electoral positioning and the demands of particular interest groups, Canada faced severely limited alternatives and extremely constrained options.
Canadian exporters depended overwhelmingly on American market access for their economic viability.
Canadian manufacturers relied on integrated supply chains crossing the border multiple times. Canadian resource producers sold predominantly to American buyers because alternatives were impractical or non-existent. That overwhelming dependence meant that when American administrations decided to apply pressure for whatever reason, Canada had no realistic choice but to absorb the economic and political costs or offer substantive concessions that addressed American demands. Trump exploited that reality relentlessly and with considerable tactical success during his first term and continuing into his second, using credible threats of tariff escalation and trade agreement termination to extract concessions on dairy market access and automotive rules of origin and countless other issues that previous American administrations had sought unsuccessfully for years. Carney is changing that fundamental dynamic systematically and deliberately through patient construction of alternatives. He is not attempting the economically irrational and practically impossible task of replacing the United States as Canada's primary trading partner, which would defy geography and existing infrastructure in decades of economic integration. He is ensuring that Canada is never again so completely dependent that saying no becomes impossible regardless of how unreasonable the demands or how damaging compliance would be to Canadian interests.
That is why Europe matters strategically to Canadian planning.
Why deepening and strengthening those transatlantic relationships receives priority attention from Carney's government and from Canadian diplomats working to rebuild partnerships. That is why China matters despite all the complications and risks involved in engaging deeply with an authoritarian great power that does not share Canadian values on human rights or democracy or rule of law. That is why diversification is no longer merely desirable policy option to be pursued when politically convenient but essential strategic imperative that must be achieved regardless of short-term costs or diplomatic complications or domestic political opposition. A country with genuine options can negotiate calmly from position of strength rather than desperately from position of weakness and fear. A country with credible alternatives can resist pressure effectively when that pressure demands unacceptable concessions that damage vital interests. A country with diversified partnerships across multiple continents can say no when circumstances require it. Can walk away from bad deals that serve the other party's interests while harming its own. Can insist on reasonable terms and walk away if those terms are not offered. That is the fundamental purpose of this Beijing visit. The core strategic objective driving Carney's diplomacy and justifying the political risks involved in engaging China. Not symbolism or spectacle designed to generate impressive photographs and favorable news coverage in Canadian media, but protection building structural safeguards against the kind of vulnerability that Trump has exploited so effectively and that threatens Canadian sovereignty and economic security. And it is precisely why Donald Trump is so visibly unsettled by the images of Carney's reception and by the implications for American leverage. Why he feels psychologically compelled to dismiss Canada's significance even as his very dismissiveness reveals how much the shifting dynamics actually concern him. Donald Trump can claim repeatedly that Canada doesn't matter. Can insist that the bilateral relationship is irrelevant to American interests. But the world through its actions is saying something entirely opposite. A Canadian Prime Minister welcomed at the highest diplomatic level an American president reduced to defensive rhetoric and a global system adjusting to the reality that Canadian agency fundamentally alters North American power dynamics.
Canada is moving forward and Trump's frustration cannot stop that trajectory.